So hey guys, how are you all doing? The series name is What If Naruto Fall in Love with Tier Halibel. So let's start the series. As Tier Harribel was chained and then left for dead, watching the Wandenrake invade Soul Society from a garganta that she was forced to open, she thought about her centuries-long life. She couldn't remember the time of when she was a human anymore. It had been far too long since she had become a hollow. But she could remember some of her early days as an average hollow. They were not much different than that of any other low-level hollow. Finding souls to eat to fill her endless hunger that could never be sated. Fighting the occasional Shinigami, which ended with her either eating their souls or on occasion running to fight another day. Those days continued for a long time, until the day when she was in Hueco Mundo and she became a part of a Jillian-class Minos, or more commonly Minos Grande. That time was blurry for anyone who became a part of a Jillian, for a Jillian consisted of thousands of hollows all in a single body moving with the same purpose that was the size of a skyscraper. But there are those within the Jillian who are able to become the core personality of the Jillian and are able to control the body. This is the case of what happened with Teir. So she continued to feed on both souls and her fellow Jillians. Her time as a Jillian was much shorter than compared to her low-level days, and the next time she regained her sense of self, she was in a Jutsu's class Minos, much smaller-sized Minos that typically looked like beasts and insects. For Teir, she was reminiscent of a shark. As an Ajuchas, she traveled the desert surface of Hueco Mundo watching her fellow hollows fight and feed on each other. And Teir became both depressed and disgusted at what they, hollows as a whole, were forced to do in order to survive. In order to live they had to feast on each other so that they could not only grow stronger but to also prevent them from regressing back into Jillians. And it was at that time that she, Tier Halibel, would put in her best efforts so that her brothers and sisters would no longer have to feed on each other in order to live. Teir didn't know how or why it happened, but after that day she changed again. Her form became more human-like and her endless hunger finally seemed to have been sated, and her powers became top-class. She had become a Vasto Lord, the top of the food chain for hollows. As a Vasto Lord she gained a small following, a faction as it was later called, of Ajuchas consisting of a deer-like hollow named Emilu Apache, a lioness named Francesca Mila Rose, and a snake named Cyan Sungsun. They were her family, and she would do all in her power to protect them. Then came the day that she met him, the bastard, who she believed in, that could help her with her dream, the Shinigami named Sosuke Aizen. He had betrayed Soul Society to obtain an item called the Hogyoku, a device created by a man named Kasuke Urahara that was capable of dissolving the boundary between Shinigami and Hollow. Aizen offered her the power to fulfill her dream and she took it. She became an Arankar, a hollow that has removed their mask, and became a part of his army. She was an Espada, the top 10 Arankar in terms of their power, and she was the third most powerful in his army, the Tercera Espada. Each Espada had was an aspect of death. Teir's aspect was that of sacrifice. Teir fought for a man who she believed in and he betrayed her. Aizen cut her down and left her for dead for she had been deemed not strong enough to fight him. If it wasn't for one of her former enemies healing her, she would have died that day. After all the fighting ended, she was one of the few surviving Arankars that were left. To her, she thought that all the fighting with the Shinigami was over and that it was possible for them to live in peace. And they did have peace for nearly 2 years. Then Iwak invaded Hueco Mundo, with his Wandenrake and the Sternritter leading the charge, decimating the Ajuchas, her fraction, and herself. The Wandenreach used them all as playthings as they tested their techniques against them, seeing how long they could last, or in her case, just plain torture. And thus as she closed her eyes she smirked, for she knew that Kurosaki Ichigo would win just like he did against Aizen. And that brought her all the comfort she needed to know before the cold embrace of death took her. Far away from the world that contained Soul Society and Hueco Mundo, there was a world that contained a village called Konohagakure. Within that village, a certain woman was currently giving birth to her first child. They were on the outskirts of the village in a cave that was covered in seals to prevent the worst-case scenario should it occur. For this woman was the host, a Jinchuriki, of the Kyubi, a powerful 9-tailed fox that could lay waste to the world just because he was in a bad mood. If a female Jinchuriki was giving birth, the seal that held the Kyubi would weaken and it was possible for him to break free, thus the reason for the seals. "It's your fault. You did this to me, Minato." She yelled towards her husband named Minato, and she clenched her fist down on his hand, nearly breaking it. Minato could only let out a dry chuckle and have an awkward smile on his face, because it was true, but it did take two to tango. Not that he was gonna tell her that, especially not right now. Yes, Kushina, it's all my fault. Damn straight it is. The now named Kushina yelled back at Minato. Kushina, the doctor started, you're almost there, just give one final push, don't tell me what to do. Minato could only apologize to the doctor as his wife gave the final push for their child to come to the world. Soon enough the cries of a child could be heard all throughout the cave they were in. Everyone was happy that the birth was a success and that the worst had not happened. Congratulations, it's a girl, the doctor announced after having cut the umbilical cord. The doctor brought the newborn babe to the exhausted mother so that she could see her child. She's beautiful, Kushina let out weakly. Just like her mother, Minato said as he walked over next to his wife and crouched down to be on the same level as them. Kushina let out a weak chuckle and a small smile as he said that. You see that man, little one? Kushina talked to her daughter. He's your papa. Hi there. Minato gave a smile to both his wife and daughter and waved as if his daughter could actually see what he was doing at the moment. Seems like we can't use the name Naruto since she's a girl. No, we can't, Kushina agreed with her husband. Jiraiya-sensei will be a bit sad, but I think he'll understand. Kushina let out a small laugh at her husband's attempted joke. He will, I'm sure of it. The two new parents were in their own world for a moment, the others in the cave letting them have it because it was a new experience for them, and just enjoying the fact that they were now parents. Teir, Kushina suddenly spoke. Minato looked at his wife. That's her name, Teir. Kushina smiled as she held the newly named Teir closer to herself. Teir, Minato let it sink in for a moment before he nodded his head. Nice to meet you, Teir-chan. I'm sure you'll do great things in your life. 4 years, Teir thought to herself. It's been 4 years since I've been reborn and I still don't think I will ever understand this man. Teir may have been reborn into a new world, but it seemed that fate or destiny or whatever governs over reincarnation decided to have fun and gave her all of her past life memories. But she knew enough to keep this to herself. Least she wished to bring misfortune to herself. Sitting across from her small 4-year-old body was a man with a mane of spiky white hair, a red headband with the kanji 4 oil written on it, and a pleasant smile that she saw was for actual happiness. This man was her godfather, Jiraiya of the Sannin. He was the teacher of her father and apparently a sage. She was doubtful of that. Both of her parents had important business. Her father was still on a mission and her mother had an important meeting that would last all day. Jiraiya just happened to be in Konoha, so they were able to leave her with him when he said that he wanted to spend some time with her. This wasn't their first meeting, far from it, but it was her first time being alone with the man. So Teir-chan, Jiraiya spoke up, Kushina tells me that you started your training to become a kunoichi. Teir nodded her tanned head. They had actually started training last year, but that was beside the point. Kushina, Minato, and Jiraiya had noticed that ever since the day she could crawl. Teir liked to be out in the sun and near water. Her parents had many heart attacks the first time they saw her crawling towards a lake without their knowing. It was also the reason why her skin had become a sun-kissed tan color as opposed to the fair complexion that her mother had. She just liked to be outside in an area where she felt comfortable. Oka-san is teaching me basic chakra controls so that I can learn her chakra chains, Teir said in a monotone voice as she ate dangos off of their stick. The tone of voice she had was one of her parents' concerns as well that they told Jiraiya about. Compared to almost all the other children in the village, she was too calm for her age. It seemed like she was older than she actually was. But then again, the Third Shinobi War was still raging. Chakra was also a new thing to her. It was similar in nature to spiritual pressure, but it was also very different. The first difference was that everyone had the ability to use chakra. They just needed the training to use it. The second was that even animals could use chakra. And the last and biggest difference that she noticed was that unlike spiritual pressure, new techniques could always be made with chakra. Oh, would you like any help with chakra control? I may not look it, but I actually am well versed with chakra manipulation, Jiraiya said as he took a sip of his tea. Okay, Erojiji, Teir said as she hopped off her seat. She was happy to get out of the house to train, even if she didn't show it. Jiraiya for his part just sat there, mouth wide open and stark white as to what his goddaughter had just called him an Erojiji. Maybe he just misheard what she said. Yeah, that was definitely it. Teir-chan, what was that you just said? Jiraiya asked with a bit of a sweat forming. Okay? Teir asked innocently. She knew what he was referring to, but she had to play the part of the 4-year-old girl still. Plus, despite what people think, she did know how to have fun and had a sense of humor. She just didn't let it show all the time. No, the part after that, Jiraiya was getting more nervous by the second. Gigi? Right before that, Teir clapped a fist against her open palm as if she figured it out. Arrow Gigi. Jiraiya froze the second it came out of Teir's mouth. It wasn't the fact that he was called a pervert, for he was a self-proclaimed super pervert. It was the fact that his 4-year-old goddaughter called him that. He didn't know why, but it just hurt his pride to be called that by her. The only reason Teir knew that Jiraiya was a pervert in the first place was because her mother, Kushina, told her to be careful around Jiraiya, especially when he's doing his research. Deciding that if she had her weekly dose of joking with this, she grabbed Jiraiya's hand with hers and said, Gia-Gigi is Gia-Gigi. Let's go train. Jiraiya regained some of the life he had lost when Teir spoke the nickname she had for him. She couldn't say his name properly when she was learning to speak and never bothered to correct it since he didn't mind the name. Yeah, let's go train. He lifelessly walked towards the door of his apartment. Jiraiya had led the two of them to the old training ground that he used to train at when he was a genin. It was a nice area that was secluded, and he thought Teir would like due to the fact that a river ran through it. Teir did in fact like the area. Nice wide open scenery with a river running by it. Trees to conceal yourself in case you didn't want to be seen. A creepy pale guy who was walking towards them. Who's that? Teir's eyes narrowed and got into a battle stance as the man approached her and Jiraiya. A look of recognition came across Jiraiya's face once he realized who the man was. Orochimaru, what brings you here? Jiraiya said as he started to walk towards the newly dubbed Orochimaru. I could ask the same of you, Jiraiya. It's not every day you see someone like yourself in a place like this. Orochimaru avoided his question. Teir decided that she did not like this man, this Orochimaru. Jiraiya seems to be friends with him, but that did not mean that she had to be. She was not going to let her guard down around him. I'm just here helping Teir-chan with her chakra control. Jiraiya used his thumb to point over to her. Oh, so this is the child between Minato and Kushina. Orochimaru's snake-like eyes studied over her like she wasn't a person, like she was a thing. She truly is interesting. Teir's hand was slowly reaching for one of her kunai that was strapped to her right leg in a pouch. She wasn't as adept with a kunai as she was with a normal blade, but she didn't have Tiburon in this life. Do you want to help also? Jiraiya asked his old friend. I know that if she had your help that she would improve in spades. I would, but it doesn't seem that I am wanted here, Orochimaru said as he continued on his path for whatever he was doing. I'll see you later, Teir-chan. He turned his head back in order to see her. Definitely do not like him. He reminds me too much of Jin. Teir thought as she released a breath she didn't know that she was holding. As I am right now, I wouldn't even be able to scratch that man. Gigi. A hint of curiosity was in Teir's voice. Jiraiya turned toward her ready to answer whatever question she seemed to have. How do you know that man? She didn't even want to speak his name. Orochimaru? She nodded her head. We were both on the same team and trained by the third Hokage together with our other partner, Tsunade. We also fought together in the Second Shinobi War. Jiraiya's gaze became glazed over as he thought back to days long past. In that gaze, Teir could have sworn that she saw sadness come across, but it was gone just as fast as it appeared. Now then, he spoke back up after he finished his remembrance. I'm going to teach you a basic technique that all shinobi use for how helpful it is. I'm going to teach you to walk on trees. The sun had already set for the day, and the duo had returned to the village for Teir's small stomach demanded that it be fed. They had decided upon a place that wasn't too far from her home and a favorite of hers to eat at. It was a ramen stall called the Chiraku's Ramen. The owner was a man named Tuchi and had a daughter named Ayam, who was the same age as Teir and one of her only friends that she had. Teir-chan, Jiraiya, welcome back. Once they had passed under the cloth sign that was the entrance, Tuchi greeted the both of them by name once he realized who it was who entered his shop. Teir-chan. Ayam came out from behind the counter and greeted her by giving a hug. Jiraiya smiled as he saw that Teir had a friend around her age before he sat down at the bar. Hello Ayam, Tuchi-ji-san. She didn't return Ayam's hug and instead opted for just patting her on the head as her response. Will it be the usual for you, Teir-chan? Tuchi asked as he brought out a sake bottle for Jiraiya. Teir nodded her head before she pried herself away from Ayam and sat next to her godfather. So you come here often then? Jiraiya asked as he poured himself a cup of sake. Teir nodded her head. I am is my friend and the ramen here is the best around. What she isn't telling you is that this is her favorite restaurant. A new voice made itself known. When Teir and Jiraiya looked to see who had just entered, they saw that it was one Namikaze Kushina who had just entered. Oka-san, Teir greeted her mother as respectfully as she could. Kushina, for her part, smiled at seeing her daughter before she sat on the other side of her to eat with her and her husband's teacher. What none of them knew though was that Canopy Bridge had been destroyed earlier that day, and fate had begun to turn its wheels. It was the day after she had been looked after by Jiraiya. Lately Teir had felt inadequate without a sword. Sure, a kunai could work for most needs, but it just didn't feel right to her. There was something about having a sword that any other weapon just couldn't compare to. So, early this morning, Teir decided to explore the village a little bit to help find something that would meet her standards. Thus she was currently in the busy streets of Konoha, window shopping for anything that she thought would be good. As she wondered, she had thought about yesterday and the man she had met. The way he presented himself was like that of Aizen, Teir thought. But he seemed to be more like a mix between Jin, who always seemed to know something and would tease one about it, and Sailaporo, in which he thought that everything and everyone was a subject to study and thought he was the smartest man in the room, a dangerous combination to be sure. It was then that a shop caught her interest. It was an out-of-the-way weapon shop that didn't seem impressive on the outside, but just from looking at the items in the window, Teir could tell that they were of high quality, so she decided to take a look inside to get her mind off of what she was just thinking about. When she got inside, Teir saw that various weapons adorned the walls on almost every centimeter of the shop. She wasn't surprised at that. What she was surprised about was that there was only one other person there with her. The woman behind the counter looked to be bored out of her mind before Teir walked in, and Teir saw that she was just reading a magazine. "Excuse me," Teir said as she walked over to the counter. The attendant looked up from her magazine and saw the top of a blonde head and blue eyes just peeking at the top of her counter. "I have a question." Putting on her best customer service and dealing with children's smile. "How can I help you, sweetie?" "I'm looking for a sword," Teir said in her usual monotone voice. "Is it for your parents?" "No, it's for me." "My, you're an aspiring kunoichi then?" Teir nodded her head in silence. "Then let's see what we have for you." Kusina was in a panic and tearing her house and village apart. Why? Her baby, her monotone angel, her Teir was missing, and she would not rest until she found her. Normally Kushina wouldn't freak out. Teir was prone to waking up early to train or going to the academy, much to Kushina's displeasure. So she thought that Teir might be at one of her normal places she normally goes to. Not that Kushina knew where they all were, because she wanted to make sure her daughter was safe. Nor was it for the fact that she wanted to take pictures of her daughter as she grew up. Nope, not at all. So when Kushina couldn't find Teir anywhere, she acted like any reasonable adult would. She calmly looked for her child and politely asked her fellow villagers if they had seen Teir. It was definitely not her fault the village may or may not have suffered a few buildings being remodeled, nor was it her fault that the famous legend of the red hot-blooded habanero grew that day. Kushina was in front of the Uchiha district when, Kushina, she turned to see her old friend, Uchiha Mikoto, and her son Itachi, waving at her. Mikoto, her worry temporarily forgotten, Kushina made her way over to her friend. "It's been a while, hasn't it? And it's good to see you as well, Itachi-kun." "Hello, Namikaze-san," Itachi said politely. Mikoto giggled at how polite her son was to her old friend. "Yes, it has been. How are you doing?" "I'm doing fine. I'm Ju." Kushina's face froze mid-speech. Both Mikoto and Itachi were confused as to what had happened to the red-headed woman in front of them. "That's right. I need to find Teir." Her eyes glowed with a fire of determination, and her hair started to stand up as if it had a will of its own. What happened to Teir-chan?" Mikoto hesitantly asked. "Mikoto," Kushina clapped down her hands on Mikoto's shoulders. "Can you help me look for Teir? She wasn't at any of her normal spots by the time I had breakfast prepared this morning. She normally doesn't miss eating with family." "I'll help," Itachi spoke up. "Ka-san has to go see the doctors today, so I'll help in her place." Itachi, Mikoto was impressed by her son's willingness to help Kushina, even if they had only met a few times before. "Thank you, Itachi-kun." Kushina bowed as she said that. "I'll take this half of the village." She gestured to the right half of the Hokage stone faces. "If you could take the other half, it would be helpful." Itachi only nodded his head in agreement before he rushed off to find Teir, who almost everyone in the village knew the description of due to how unique she looked in Konoha. Teir had been through several different types of blades within the few hours that she had been in the weapon shop. She had used katanas, wakizashis, odachis, tachis, chikutos, tsurugis, kodachis. Hell, she even used a massive zanbato, new or old in design. It didn't matter to her. She was looking for a sword that she could deem to be her partner, and she would not settle for anything less. The reason it had taken her so long to go through each type of sword there was because each one had a different way of handling and different techniques to use, even if they all were very similar in build, and none of the styles seemed to suit her, even if some people said that she was using the blade quite expertly. Seeming dissatisfied with the blade she was using, she sheathed it and returned it to the store owner. The store owner, for her part, was a bit frustrated. She understood that Teir wanted to find the right sword, but all the swords that she had been offered were weighed, they were measured, and they were found wanting. Nothing seemed to satisfy her, and she was about to tell her to look at another shop when Teir handed her the last blade. "Would I be able to give you a design for a blade?" Teir asked with eyes that spoke years beyond her age. The owner was taken aback by the look in the girl's eyes and was momentarily stunned. "Why, yeah, you can. The price would be paid when you come to pick up the blade. There's a scroll and a brush inside if you want to design it." Teir seemed to be pleased with the answer that was given to her and went inside to design her partner. In her time at the shop, and the many blades she had used, she had learned of a metal that could channel chakra and act as a conduit for some justice. The metal was simply called chakra metal and the blades were chakra blades. The metal itself was rare, so it would no doubt cost quite a bit of coin, but Teir was confident that she would be able to get enough money by the time the blade was forged. "These people are very creative," Teir sarcastically thought as she picked up the brush and began to draw her old partner Tiburon from memory. It was not particularly long, but it was unusually wide and had a distinction of being hollow in the middle of the blade, which pretty much made it look like nothing but the edges on what would otherwise be a normal sword. The wrapping around the handle was purple, with the guard being a bit longer than the blade was and had 3 small holes at both ends, which she had previously used to unsheath her partner. It had taken her half an hour, and many redraws, but Teir had finally managed to draw the blade that had been her partner. She was in the middle of admiring her handiwork when she felt a presence behind her, and quickly drew one of her kunai to scare the person who was trying to sneak up on her. A clash of metal rang throughout the area they were in. The one who had snuck up upon her was a boy around her age with jet black hair and onyx-colored eyes. He wore a black shirt with a high collar and white pants along with the standard kunai leg pouch and wore black shinobi sandals. She recognized him because of how he was hailed as a prodigy. Much like herself, she was facing Uchiha Itachi. "So you're Namikaze Teir," Itachi said flatly. The girl before him had sun-kissed hair that was put into a single braid, and bright blue eyes. Her skin was sun-tanned and reminiscent of a person from Konohagakure. She wore a white one-piece dress that had small slits on the sides for increased flexibility with black spat shorts underneath, while she wore black shinobi sandals. "And you're Uchiha Itachi," Teir responded in her equally flat tone. They locked eyes for a second as their kunais were locked against each other, and in that moment of their eyes meeting and blades clashing, there was a moment of understanding between the two. Neither knew just what they understood of the other, but both felt a kinship. For Itachi, it was like meeting Shursui again, a comrade. As for Teir, she had not met anyone like this before, this life or the last. Her Frachin had followed her because they had believed in her strength and words. But the one before her was different. She just didn't know how yet. "You know that your mother is looking for you, right?" Itachi was the first to speak. "Ka-san?" Teir was a bit perplexed by this. Then she realized that she didn't leave a note or anything to explain what she was going to do today. "Guess I'll go meet up with her then, after I turn this in." Itachi nodded as Teir started to roll up the scroll she was using. "What did you make?" Itachi was curious as to why she was here, but guessing by the shop they were in that it had something to do with a weapon. "A partner." Teir smirked as she said this before she handed the scroll to the store owner and left with Itachi. Kushina was really starting to worry now. It was well past midday and Teir had yet to show herself. She was hoping that Itachi had found her, otherwise she might go insane. The war was still going on, and it was still possible for anything could happen, especially with who her husband was and the enemies he had made. "Maybe I should ask Jiraiya to help me." Kushina shook her head. "No, I'm not that desperate yet." "Ka-san?" Kushina's mood instantly brightened as she recognized the voice it belonged to, and the fact that one person in the village would call her Ka-san. Kushina turned around and as soon as she saw her daughter she embraced her into a hug. Teir-chan. Do you know how worried I was? Sorry Ka-san, there was just something that I needed to do today, Teir said as she returned her mother's hug. It was still strange to her, these interactions with her family, and this bond that they shared. She wasn't sure of how she should ever respond when they do show affection, so she copied what her parents did and slowly she was starting to learn. Well, next time, Kushina let go of their embrace. Tell me when you want to go out and where you go, okay? Teir nodded her head in response and Kushina whipped some tears out of her eyes. So what was so important that you had to do it today? I needed to find a partner, Teir said simply. A partner? Kushina tilted her head in confusion. Like a teammate? No, Teir shook her head, but I think I found one of those today as well. Well then you can tell us all about your day over dinner. A third voice entered the conversation. Minato! Welcome home. Kushina embraced her husband into a hug as soon as he made himself known, which he returned. Teir wasn't quite as affectionate as her mother, but she still did go to her father's side as she patted her head. She definitely did not enjoy her father patting her head. Nope, not at all. So then, Minato stated as he and Kushina both held Teir's hands. What shall we eat? Ramen, Teir said. Teir, we just had that last night. Kushina half laughed, half scolded. Ramen, she repeated. Ramen it is then. Minato smiled at his daughter. By the way, who is the teammate you found? Teir had that her father was asking for a who and not for anything else, so she went with the simple truth. Uchiha Itachi, she said simply. If one listened closely they could have heard Minato's world shatter at the fact that his daughter mentioned a boy's name who wasn't him or Jiraiya. One would also notice that his smile froze in place, and his entire body was stark white. Unfortunately for him, Kushina noticed this and a spark of mischief shinned in her eye. Teir-chan, do you like Itachi-kun? Kushina baited her daughter. I do like him better than most. Teir saw what was happening and decided to let her mother have her fun. Cracks started to appear on her father as she said this. My, Kushina faked her surprise. He's caught your eye. He is interesting. This was true. He had piqued Teir's interest. Minato was starting to crumble in the wind. So then if you had to choose between Teir-san, Itachi-kun, and Ramen, which would you choose? Ramen, Teir stated in a matter-of-fact tone. I lost to Ramen. Minato crumbled into the wind. I lost my daughter to not only a boy, but I lost to Ramen. Kushina couldn't help but laugh at Minato's current state. She honestly thought she wouldn't see this for a few more years, at least. Teir decided to walk over to what was left of her father, and flashed him the brightest smile she could, which to anyone else just looked like a smirk. Don't worry Teir-san, you'll always hold your place, Teir said. Teir, Minato regained himself as he saw his daughter's smirk, that was directed at him, and had tears in his eyes. After Ramen, and thus Minato returned to the wind. Teir had to have a bit of fun too after all. Teir-san, Teir peeked over Minato's shoulder as he was writing something on his kunai. Yes, Teir? Minato didn't pause in his work but he did slow down a little so he could properly speak with his daughter. What are you doing? She had seen her father do this many times when she was younger, but was not allowed near because of her age. They also thought that she may hurt herself. Teir understood that her parents loved her and wanted her to stay safe, but sometimes they were just overprotective. This? Minato moved over a little bit so that Teir could see better. I'm working on one of my special jutsu, the Hiraishin no Jutsu. He held up one of his completed kunai to show her. How does it work, and what does it do? This was probably the most that Minato has seen Teir express her interest so openly. Well, Minato entered his instructor mode and grabbed one of his blank kunai. I need one of my kunai first. He placed it in the center of his work area, then, by using Fuinjutsu, I placed my mark on my kunai. He held one hand flat onto the kunai and concentrated his chakra into his palm and used his other hand to perform a hand seal. Normally one would have to write out the seals for Fuinjutsu, but Minato was able to create the seal for his Hiraishin no Jutsu by just manipulating his chakra into his palm and performing a hand seal. The only reason he was able to do this was because once one had a mastery of the single seal, masters of this art form were able to imprint the seal onto their chakra for quick use. Fuinjutsu? Teir had heard of Fuinjutsu before but she had not been able to learn much about it aside from the fact that it was a type of sealing jutsus. Yes, Fuinjutsu. Minato could honestly say that he was enjoying this time of teaching his daughter. The techniques of Fuinjutsu are that of sealing, and can seal just about anything, if done properly. Your mother's side of the family taught me most of what I know, from what scrolls were left behind, while Jiraiya-sensei taught me the basics. Gyojiji did? Yes, he did, so he can actually do more than look at women. Minato's sweat dropped as he heard Teir say this. I might have to talk to Jiraiya-sensei about toning it down around here. So what does this seal do then? Teir pointed at the kunai he had just completed his seal on. This allows me to use the Hiraishin no Jutsu anywhere where I place my mark. He handed Teir his kunai and motioned for her to go to the other side of the room as he walked as far away from her as possible. Once they were both in position, he activated his jutsu and was by her side instantly. Teir went wide-eyed because her battle instincts told her that her father had moved behind her, fast, much faster than a Sonido or a Shunpa, and it seems to be based off the Shunshin. The marks are permanent and allowed to travel to the location of the mark instantly. Minato took his kunai out of Teir's hand and placed it back with the rest. Teir, going wide-eyed, did not go unnoticed by him, so he thought that he may have more opportunities to spend time with her and teach her both his techniques and the legacy that was the Uzumaki clan. After all, right now Kushina was doing most of her ninjutsu training, but one of the most helpful techniques to learn this is the Shunshin. I'll explain why later though. Teir walked back over to Minato as he pulled out several scrolls. Would you like to learn how to do Fuinjutsu? I'll be in your care. Tusan, she bowed her head and he laughed at her display before they sat down and began the basics. Concentrate, Teir, Kushina told her daughter. Controlling this many chains takes quite a bit of effort for someone who started not too long ago. Teir only nodded as she concentrated on the task at hand. She was working on the adamantine sealing chains that her mother had started teaching her several months ago. When she first started, it was difficult for her to even move one around. And now she could use over 50 with ease, but anything over 80 took effort. Not that she would ever need to use that many, but she would not let her skill dull if she could still improve it. The reason why it had been so difficult was due to the nature of chakra itself. While it was similar to spiritual pressure in nature, it required more effort to use. One had to blend both their spiritual energy, which was not spiritual pressure, and their physical energy. If either of the two was not mixed properly, it could result in a jutsu being performed incorrectly, and that had a multitude of various outcomes. That was not even counting how to move a single chain, let alone multiple chains, as if they had a will of their own. That took a few weeks to learn, while it normally took months to learn. Currently she was working on making her 85th chain autonomous. The first 50 were moving on their own, and sometimes blocking random shuriken and kunai that came at her. 51 through 80 were just moving around haphazardly, doing whatever her mind could subconsciously have them do. 81 through 84 were just floating around waiting for a command. Teir wanted her chains to act like how her mother's did, how they seemed alive, but were actually just an extension of her and her will. Kushina had told her that the chains were meant more for sealing purposes than anything else, but there were some who were able to use them in combat. That was what Teir was aiming for. A crack started to appear in the chain, and both she and Kushina knew that she was at her current limit. If she pushed too far with it, the chain would explode and a backlash would occur. She didn't need another backlash today. Her body was already weak from the other 5 backlashes that she had already caused, and one more would be disastrous to her. Why don't we take a break? Kushina said right before Teir dismissed the chains. Teir sat down in exhaustion, and her mother walked over and placed Teir's head in her lap. She didn't mind that much. She knew that her mother was just taking care of her. The fact that her mother's fingers running through her currently unbraided hair comforted her had nothing to do with it. Nope, not at all. Kushina started to hum some random song as they stayed in the forest that they were training in. What a strange thing it is, a parent's love, Teir thought. They show affection even when I do something wrong. Guide me with a gentle hand, scold me when something is wrong, but it's all unconditional. They don't expect anything from me aside from just existing, truly a strange thing. And so the mother and daughter just enjoyed the moment they were in, listening to the sound of the forest, the chirping of the birds, the soft whistling of the wind, the rustling of the leaves against each other, the flow of the river and the splashes against the rocks. Even the sunlight that peeked through the leaves seemed to softly whisper to Teir's ear. But there was a faint crunching sound that caught her attention, a repeated sound that was starting to grow louder with each passing second. Teir turned her head towards the sound and Kushina looked in the same direction. What they saw was a teenager with gravity-defying silver hair, a mask covering the lower half of his face, his Konoha headband covering his left eye, and a melancholy look about him as he stared into the ground ahead of him as he walked. Teir recognized the teen as one of her father's students, Hatake Kakashi. "Kakashi-kun," Kushina called out and waved to him. Kakashi seemed to come out of whatever rut he was in and saw that it was Kushina that called out to him. "Kushina-san." Teir-chan, it wasn't his first time seeing the wife and daughter of his teacher, but when he normally met them they were with his teacher. "What are the two of you doing out here?" "Just some last-minute training before the big day tomorrow." Kushina smiled brightly at the mention of tomorrow. Teir was a bit irritated at that. They hadn't told her what was going on and kept it a big secret. "How about you, Kakashi-kun? What are you doing here?" "Me?" Kakashi almost looked confused at that. Like he wasn't expecting it. "I was lost on the path of life, I guess." "Oh, is that so?" Kushina didn't mind him skirting around the question. She knew the area and what was nearby, so she was able to guess as to why he was here. "Hopefully you don't stay lost for Ling and come over for dinner sometime soon. We'd all enjoy you coming over. Even Teir-chan would?" Kakashi looked over to the small blonde, who was still laying on Kushina's lap, as if asking for confirmation. Teir didn't verbally respond and just stared at Kakashi for a moment. Then too, and Kakashi was starting to get a bit nervous from her flat gaze. What seemed like an eternity to Kakashi was only a few seconds for Teir before she decided to respond. "It would be nice to have Hatake-san over for dinner again, even if he doesn't think so." Kushina giggled at her daughter's response. Like she wouldn't expect anything less. Kakashi, who was not as experienced at being around Teir, just sweat dropped at her response. "I'll make sure to tell you when I come over." He just stood there for a moment in awkwardness. He didn't really know what to do right now, so he did the best thing he could think of. "I guess I'll be going then. I have to meet Minato-sensei about in a bit." Kakashi bowed and left the mother and the daughter alone again. "So what is going on tomorrow?" Teir looked up at her mother, who just giggled. "You'll find out tomorrow." Teir's eye twitched ever so slightly. She should have known. The signs were all there. The rumors had been spreading around the village, and some of them had been preparing as if it was festival. But she had ignored it all because she didn't deem it as noteworthy at the time. She shouldn't have done that. Her time in Hueco Mundo should have taught her that the smallest signs of anything were not meaningless. Today was the day that the new Hokage was being announced. The crowds had gathered in front of the Hokage Tower and they filled the streets. The entire village was there, jam-packed so they could see the new face of their Hokage. Teir was not down there. She was on top of the tower standing next to her mother as they watched the back of the figure ahead of them. The back of her father. Her father, Namikaze Minato, had been chosen to become the fourth Hokage. I can understand why they wanted it to be a surprise, but they really should have told me, Teir thought as her father threw his hat into crowd, which the crowd loved and cheered even louder than they just were. That was when her instincts flared to life. They were telling her to run. She felt a predatory gaze all over her, but with so many people around her, she couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It studied her, watching her slightest reactions and muscle movements to how it was dissecting her. There had been many people in the village who had given her odd looks and curious gazes, but only a handful people had given her a haze that was similar to this one. It was also at this time that she wished her new blade was completed. It wasn't that she felt weak or unsafe without a weapon. It was just that when one spends years upon years of having a weapon essentially attached to them, a weapon was a comfort to have at any time. I may not be a sensory type like a Hyuga, but maybe I need to develop a technique. Good thing I understand how Pesquisa works. All I'll need is a few minor tweaks to it. The day had passed just as any other had, the only difference being that her father was now Hokage, and day had turned to night. The moon was out in full, no clouds to block it, and the Konoha had quieted down for the night. The peace and quiet of the night was one of her favorite times. There was just something about it that put her at ease, just like how places of water did. You know it's rude to sneak up on a woman at night, Teir said as she stared up at the moon. It's not sneaking up if you know I'm coming and you're not quite a woman yet, Itachi said as he stood next to Teir. Besides, you're one of the few people I don't think I can sneak up on. Teir didn't respond to Itachi on that, for it was a fact. Ever since they had first met, both of them had made an effort to memorize the other's chakra signature, for they considered the other to be a kindred spirit. Much of what they believed in was the same, and both wondered what the third shinobi war was fought for. They had been regularly meeting at night like this so that they could speak with one another. Most of the time Itachi's best friend Shizuya would come with him. This time it seemed he hadn't, so it was only the two of them tonight. Normally they would discuss the future and what they could do to try and end the fighting, but not tonight. So your father is Hokage now, Itachi stated, his gaze still at the moon. Yes, he is. Teir did the same as her companion. Congratulations on that. Why are you congratulating me? I'm not the one who became the Hokage, because I can't tell that to Hokage-sama right now. Fair enough. Teir, Teir turned her gaze away from the moon and saw that Itachi was staring at her. His stare held a determination in it, one she had only seen on him a few times so far. My Ka-san is pregnant, so it is possible that we won't meet again like this for a long while. Then I shall await until we can do this again. Sure, Sui and I have yet to have a one-on-one conversation yet, so maybe I'll wait with him, and congratulations. She gave a soft smirk. Itachi, seeing what she was doing, played along with her. For what? It's not like I'm the one who's pregnant, because I can't tell that Mikoto-san right now. Fair enough. Itachi smirked as well. After their banter was over, the two may be different from the others their age and many may not have understood them, but the two of them didn't care. They were able to understand the other, and their humor, which most considered to be dry at times, was another thing that they understood about another. The two then returned their gaze to the moon as they just watched in silence as it just hung above the dark landscape, like a beacon of light in the darkness of the world. Are you sure about this, Minato? Kushina asked hesitantly. Yes, I am, his face serious as he wrote down onto the scroll in front of him. As much as I'd rather not do this, we still are shinobi. We don't know when we'll die. Kushina looked down at the ground as Minato said that. She couldn't refute his words, but she truly did not want to think about the possibility of it happening. The silence of the night and the movement of Minato's brush being the only noises in their room. That's why I'm doing this, in case something does happen. This way we can leave something useful behind for Teir. Kushina sat down next to Minato and held out her hand with a few tears in her eyes. Hand me a brush. I can't have only you leaving her something after all. Teir laid on the ground staring up at the sky. It was a relatively nice day in her opinion. There were a few clouds in the sky that provided occasional shade. It wasn't too hot nor too cold. The gentle breeze felt nice as well against her lightly sweating body. All in all, it was just a nice day to be outside. That makes 27 wins, 27 loses, and 3 draws. Itachi's voice gained her attention as she slightly moved her head to look at him. Since you got your sword, our fights have gotten longer and are much more difficult. I think that I would be hard-pressed if I went against you purely with Zanjutsu. I guess I should take that as a compliment then. Teir gave him a small smirk, which constituted as her form of a smile, and motioned for her friend to come and join her on the ground. Itachi decided to lay next to her, since they had been sparring against each other for the past 2 hours. It's not like either of them didn't deserve to rest. The two friends just decided to relax in the presence of one another. They didn't really need to speak in order for them to be comfortable. Even the silence they shared still held a conversation that the two of them understood, although to an outsider, it would just seem like the two of them just didn't know how to speak to the other. They were, after all, just a young boy and a young girl. After a few minutes though, Itachi finally decided to ask a question that had been on his mind since this morning. So, what is the name of your blade? Teir gripped the handle of her blade and held it above her, the sun reflecting off the metal and passing through the open middle of the blade itself. She had thought of the name long before it was forged. It wasn't quite like the weapon of her soul that she had used in her precious life, but it was close, and it did bring a sense of comfort to her with the familiar feeling of the blade itself. The only problem she currently had was that the blade was just a bit shorter than her current height, and that the weight would take a short amount of time to get used to, since she was still just a child with 5 years to her current life. Tiburon segunda, Teir said as an actual smile graced her face. A few hours earlier, there was a knock on the door of the Namikaze household. Coming, Kushina projected her voice so that the person outside could hear her. She finished wiping her hands when she reached the door, and opened it. She wasn't too surprised when she found out that it was Itachi who was at the door. In fact, she was happy to see the young boy. It did not have to do with the fact that it just gave her more ammunition against both Teir, who had hardly worked on, and her husband, who would either go into a pseudo-depression or just plain break. Nope, not at all. She would still have her fun either way. My Itachi-kun, it's good to see you again. Are you here for Teir-chan? Itachi simply nodded his head to her question. He had long since learned, from both Teir and his own experience of hanging around her family, that he would be used for Kushina's amusement. But that was only every so often as opposed to all the time. Then when she wasn't using him to tease her family, she was pleasant to be around. Itachi-kun, you're so polite for such a young shinobi, for using the front door instead of the window. I feel that if I tried to use Teir's window to meet her, both you and Hokage-sama would be very upset. You're not wrong at that. Kushina just gave a dark chuckle at that. I'll go grab her for you. Teir. Right when Kushina turned around, she came face to face with her daughter and her ever-stoic face, who was hanging upside down, from the ceiling, and right in front of her face. After the initial shock faded, and her heart rate slowed down, she grabbed a hold of her daughter's cheeks and pulled, hard and angrily. Teir! Why would you scare me like that? Itachi had to take a step back, for he was witnessing, again, why Kushina had the nickname of the red hot-blooded habanero. Add to the fact that her hair seemed to be alive and rising on its own just made her that much more fierce. Teir had to wait a minute before her mother let go of one of her cheeks to somewhat properly talk. I says shock get we funny. You thought it'd be funny? Kushina's anger level rose and veins were starting to appear on her head, and her fist, which Kushina rose as well. Normally, she would have just punched the offender from above them, but she opted not to do that and continued to pull on Teir's cheeks, albeit much harder than before. After 5 minutes of Kushina's scolding and punishing her child, who was still hanging upside down, she finally decided to ask her the question that's been on her mind since her scolding started. Teir, why are you hanging upside down? Training, was Teir's instant reply. This girl, Kushina let out a sigh before a smile crept up onto her face. She's so much like her father. Everyone in the village had said that Teir looked more like her mother. Just with her father's hair and eyes. Teir then dropped down from the ceiling, with a small flip to land on her feet, and walked past her mother. Then I'll be heading off, she said as she went to Itachi's side. Be home before dark. There have been some missing people reports, Kushina told both the children as they walked away. She knew that she didn't need to repeat herself because of how they both were. Kushina held a hand up to her mouth to prevent the vomit that she felt coming up from her stomach. This wasn't the first time that this has happened in the past couple of weeks. She had an idea of what it was, since she had already had Teir. But she was going to the doctor's today just to make sure it was what she thought it was. So your sword finally came in then? Itachi asked as they walked down the busy streets of Konoha. Yes, Teir also nodded her head as she said this. Apparently once they learned whose daughter I was, they made it a priority order. Adults are weird like that, trying to gain favor with one another. Teir only nodded her head again to agree with him. The rest of the trip was relatively quick as they made their way to the weapons store that Itachi had only been to once. As they rounded the corner they came across the site of the familiar store and walked right into it. The ringing of the chime alerted the store clerk inside of customers and Akishi say that it was Teir. Her eyes lit up in joy. Welcome back, she greeted the duo. It seems like you received my message about your blade coming in today. Teir nodded her head. It's in the back. I'll go grab it right now. The clerk went into the back room, leaving the two of them in silence as they waited for her to return. It took a minute or two, but when the clerk returned, she was holding an object that was wrapped in cloth. It was obviously her new sword. The store clerk unwrapped it to reveal the lavender-colored sheath with its purple wrapping at the hilt. She handed the sheathed blade to Teir, who proceeded to take it out of its sheath to inspect it. She inspected all over the blade, including the hollowed-out portion much to the confusion of Itachi, before she gave it a few practice swings, seemingly done with her inspection. Teir placed the blade back into its sheath. AMD put the blade on the counter. How much left do I owe? Teir had been earning some ryo from odd jobs around the village and paying the cost of the blade off slowly. Let's see. The clerk opened up the ledger she had and flipped a couple of pages to find the right one. Your remaining balance, after a 10% discount, 3 is 38,000 ryo. Teir pulled out her coin purse/pouch that seemed like it was about to burst from the seams with all the rolled-up ryo and coins that was within it. She poured out the content onto the counter and started to organize it all to make it easier for the clerk herself. 37,000 damn, just 1,000 short, Teir mumbled to herself. The clerk was just about to say that the last 1,000 not mattering much, mostly because she wanted to stay on the good graces of the Hokage, when Itachi placed 1,000 ryo bill onto the counter. Both Teir and the clerk just looked at him in confusion for a second before the clerk collected all the money to store away. Teir grabbed her new blade and held it close to her chest. Itachi, why did you pay for the last 1,000? She nodded her head. Consider it an early birthday present from me. I'm unsure if I'll be able to go and celebrate it with you. Teir just gave him a deadpan of a stare. And it has nothing to do with that. You wouldn't have known what to get me. Itachi kept his face clear of emotion, but Teir could see the slight twitch of a muscle to try and turn his head away. She let out a sigh. Either way, thank you. You don't know how much this means to me. An actual smile appeared on her face, and Itachi felt his heart start to race a little bit, and his stomach felt a bit weird, strange, the young boy thought. Maybe there was something bad in Ka-san's breakfast this morning. The boy simply shrugged the feeling off as bad food. Itachi, the sound of Teir's voice brought his attention back to her and her ever-stoic face. Maybe it was just my imagination after all, he thought. Would you like to spar with me? Present time. The two friends were sitting near the top of the trees of the forest they were in watching the sun set, which was a great deal better than watching it from the top of a hill. Who does that anyway? The two of them had stopped their sparring matches about an hour ago and just decided to enjoy themselves. So have you told your parents about Tiburon Segunda yet? Itachi asked, not taking his eyes away as the sun was slowly descending on the horizon. The name of that his friend had given the blade was extremely strange for him to say. No, I haven't yet. Even though she knew he wasn't watching her, she still shook her head from habit, and knowing that he still somehow knew she was doing it, I figured I would surprise them. I can imagine that there'll be a lot of yelling. Agreed. The sun finally set when the two of them decided to head back to residential part of the village. The two of them had parted ways, since they lived in opposite directions of each other, and currently Teir was walking by herself down the street with Tiburon strapped to her side, more towards her back. The street itself was practically deserted, since it wasn't one of the main streets but still not an alleyway either. But she was currently by herself. That was when she froze in place. The same gaze that had been leering on the day her father became Hokage was now, once again, hungrily perversed over her body. She truly hated this feeling. Be home before dark. There have been some missing people reports. Then she remembered what her mother had told her as she was leaving. Damn it, I was too happy about having Tiburon again that I forgot what Ka-san told me. But it seems like now it would be a good time to test it out, Teir thought as she cleared her mind out. She ignored the feeling of what the gaze was doing to her, drowned out the far-off noise of the villagers enjoying the nightlife. She ignored everything as she built up the chakra in her body. When she had built it to the point that she remembered the technique required, she released it as a pulse in every direction around it. She made sure it was subtle, so that way no one could detect it unless they tried to. She had used pesquisa. She was still working on it in this new world. It still took a great deal of effort and all of her focus to use. But the more she practiced it, the less effort it took to do. In her mind's eye, she saw the chakra of 3 different individuals who were watching her. 2 of the 3 seemed to be the ones who were ogling at her, while the last one seemed a bit familiar. It seemed a bit sad and lonely, and it was this and that was coming closer to her, but not at an alarming speed, against her better judgment. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to wait and see who was coming closer to her. The sound of footsteps slowly entered her ears, and she placed one of her fingers into the rings that were on the guard of Tiburon. They're purposely making themselves known. Either they're confident in their abilities or are approaching without hostility. Teir widened her feet as a figure started to form from the darkness. Let's find out which it is. When the figure emerged into the moonlight, the first thing that Teir noticed was the black clothing that was covered by gray armor. He had the standard kunai pouch on his leg, but the most interesting thing about him was the dog mask that he wore to cover his face. An Umbu agent then. What? Wow, her thoughts were cut off when she noticed his gravity-defying, silver hair. Does Hataki-san really thought no one would know it was him when his hair is like that? But then again, they could just say it is a wig. Teir had to stop herself from letting out an exhausted sigh as she thought about this. That's not what I should be focusing on right now. The dog-masked man knelt down onto one knee to not show he was hostile towards Teir. Teir-sama. That voice, so it is Hataki-san, Teir thought as she relaxed her stance. She also felt the gazes, since there were 2 of them, recede back and left her alone with the Umbu Black Ops member. Yes, Dog-chan? She might as well play along with the fact that he thought she didn't know who he was. She had to admit that it was a bit funny when he gave her an odd look with the chan suffix. It's dangerous for a girl of your age to be wandering around a street like this by yourself. I'll escort you home. Dog stayed still as he waited for her response. The other 2 ran away when he made himself known to me. It might be better to stay with him for now. Teir nodded her head and Dog stood up to walk over to her side. He placed a hand on her shoulder and shined the both of them. When they reappeared, they were in front of her house. The lights were still on, and Teir could swear that she heard the faint voices of her parents yelling about something. I'll take my leave here. Dog then moved away from Teir and used the shunshin to go back to whatever he was doing beforehand. Teir decided that it was best to get the scoldings from her mother over with, and doubted she would be able to leave the house for the next little bit. She sighed at the thought of being cooped up on the house all day long. She took a deep breath as she stood right outside the door. She needed to mentally prepare herself after all. She still wasn't used to getting lectured. It just felt weird. She opened the door and in a loud voice announced, "I'm home." Whatever her parents were yelling/arguing about came to a stop when she announced herself. She heard the familiar sound of her mother's footsteps rushing from the kitchen/living room area to the door. Teir! Whatever Teir was expecting, it was not the smiling face of her mother. "I have some great news." She saw her equally happy father come around the corner after Kushina did. Either of them had yet to notice to Baron Segunda yet. Giagigi finally got married? Both if her parents laughed at her guess. No, nothing as surprising as that. Her mother approached her and knelt down to be at eye level with her. Teir. Her mother paused just to build up the anticipation. "You're gonna be in one Isan." It took a minute for her brain to truly process the words that had been said. Her, Namikaze Teir, the former Tres Espada and the current daughter of the Yellow Flash, and the red-hot-blooded habanero is going to have a younger sibling. When? Both parents smiled as they saw the shining in their daughter's eyes. "When will I get to be in one Ichan?" "Well, I'm due on." Kushina lost mid-sentence, as something finally clicked in her brain. She had just seen a glint of purple shift out of the corner of her eye and decided to look at what it was. What she had found was a weird-looking sword that was unusually wide on the hip of her, currently, only daughter. Her hair started to fly and move on its own and an aura of fire seemingly appeared behind her. She once again grabbed both of Teir's cheeks while calmly shouting, where she obtained a sword from. Minato could only chuckle at the display of his wife and daughter interacting, and wondered how it would be if they had a son. Namikaze Teir was once again reminded though that was the daughter of both the Yellow Flash and the red-hot-blooded habanero of Konohagakure, and she wouldn't have it any other way in this life.